Overnight, Retroville, one of Kiev's most modern shopping malls, was destroyed, killing 8 people and causing enormous economic harm. While Russian media have claimed the Ukrainian army used the place, it's a type of targeting that announces a new attritional phase to this.
We've seen this before on the part of the Russian armed forces. We've seen them do this before. It's something that they did in Chechnya in the 1990s and again in the early noughties. It's something they've been involved with in Syria. And again, you know, in the absence of an easy military victory, breaking morale, I guess, has to be necessary. It has to be part of the plan.
During the past week, battlefield advances have slowed to a crawl. The Ukrainians did push back Russian advances near Mykolaiv, and there's been some Russian progress in the Donbas, of which more later. But overall, the Russian military shows signs of having used up its initial allocation of units and supplies, something the military calls culmination.
For Putin to achieve his aims, I think he's got to continue to do what he is doing, probably until he reaches a pain point that says, and now is the time, the best moment for me to negotiate. That's possibly is that the best option? No, it's a ghastly option, and it's a ghastly option for Ukraine. But if it stops the war, well and good. However, I'm not sure that he will do that.
This social media footage is said to show Russian ambulances taking large numbers of wounded to hospital trains. Certainly, thousands of soldiers have been lost, and without a large-scale use of reservists or conscripts, which would take time to arrange, Russia cannot change the dynamic.
The Russian government is quite keen, where possible, to avoid pulling more of Russian society into this war. And I think that is for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it would require them to admit that what they're fighting is a war, which they've legislated to stop Russians talking about. It's illegal to describe this as a war in Ukraine. But of course, you know, once you start pulling in large numbers of conscripts, once you start potentially pulling in teenagers, you know, to go and fight, then whatever popularity there is or support there is for the war, we're going to see decline fairly rapidly, I would have thought.
At the same time, while Ukrainian forces have combined Western-supplied missiles with defensive grit to halt Russian advances, they haven't been able to reconquer much of what they've lost, because they've suffered their own losses and have a limited ability to counterattack.
If they can develop the combat power necessary for the sort of mobile counteroffensive, well and good. But they've got to be really careful, because if they do, and they're not completely joined up, completely sophisticated in their combined arms battle, they could come seriously unstuck.
So the Russian army is trying to consolidate gains in the Donbas with a new push to expand the separatist area. And of course at Mariupol, where heavy firepower is being used to crush the defenders. The aim could be to allow the Kremlin to say it's secured Crimea's water supply, completed a corridor to the Donbas, and secured the separatist republics prior to talking more seriously about peace. So the Russian army is pretty much rooted where it is now, unless there's a major reinforcement, which would take a long time to do. The Ukrainians, for their part, have shown a limited ability so far to recapture lost ground, and if it comes to negotiations, they'll be very, very reluctant to concede the permanent occupation of Russian forces in those areas. In other words, it's a formula for military and diplomatic stalemate. Of course, our Western view of this state of play is hardly likely to be shared by the Kremlin, where the will to win remains, and who knows what tactics or escalation might be tried before the fighting is brought to a close.
In a moment, we'll discuss some of the points raised by Mark, but first we can hear some testimony from 2 people who have fled Mariupol. We'll hear first from Anya, a psychologist. She fled the city with her friends last Tuesday.
I had one wish. If my house gets bombed, I want to die instantly. I don't want to die slowly under rubble or bleed to death, because there were so many dead bodies on the street. They couldn't get any help because there was no patrol, so ambulances couldn't reach the injured. There was also no phone signal, so you couldn't even call them. We started our journey from Mariupol on the 15th of March, and we found out about the evacuation by accident. We were told by some people who managed to get into Mariupol to pick up their relatives, but there was no green corridor. We decided to take the risk because it was impossible to stay there any longer. We thought that we would either die from shelling or from hunger. During normal times, the drive to Dnipro from Mariupol would take 4 hours. We drove for 2 days. When we crossed the so-called border between the occupied territory to the territory controlled by the Ukrainian army, we stood in the queue. And that moment we got fired on from Grad rocket launchers. They came from the side controlled by the Russian soldiers. We were in a convoy of civilian cars. Many of the cars were broken, they had no windows, we were just trying to survive, just evacuating our children, and we were being fired at.
Pretty shocking testimony. We can now hear from Ira. Unlike Anya, her family didn't have access to a car. The mother of two had to wait for a relative to drive her to safety. Now she's escaped the horror of Mariupol and is a short distance away from the town.
I thought we were lucky because when we were leaving, our house hadn't been hit. But now I don't think there is a house anymore. The city has been obliterated. Me, my husband, my mum, our children, we couldn't leave the city because we didn't have a car. We were lucky because my relative came to pick us up. When we were leaving the flat, we ran off without shoes. When we arrived in Melekino, that's a village next to Mariupol, we came here without food. We queued for some food, but they ran out just when it was our turn. The shopkeeper felt sorry for me and my toddler, so she gave us half a loaf of bread. So our family of 5 had half a loaf for a day. The food prices are very high, but at least you can buy something here. Now we can buy tea and we can buy bread.